Right now, I think it's safe to say we're all thinking about the future a lot, which is very uncertain. One of the questions I am really thinking about is, I don't know, my kids going back to school. Are they going back to school in the fall? I'm interested in this because my wife and I are trying to homeschool them, and it's a lot. We're doing our best, but also because this is probably the biggest policy question that policymakers across the world and in this country are wrestling with. I mean, closing down schools was probably the single biggest step that governments took to contain the virus, right? It affected 55 million students in this country. And it seems really unclear how to go about safely reopening all these schools. Because when you're talking about schools, I mean, you're talking about everything from daycare and pre-K to elementary school to massive high school with, 1,800 teenagers who, are they going to listen to what you tell them to do on social distancing? You're talking about schools in very rich districts with lots of facilities and money, and schools in very poor districts. You're also talking about colleges. And each one of these places is kind of battling with its own imperatives and concerns and resource constraints. Here to talk a little bit about how schools and parents and policymakers are thinking about all this is Dana Goldstein. She's New York Times national correspondent covering education. She recently co-wrote a piece called "Despite Trump's Nudging, Schools Are Likely to Stay Shut for Months." Dana, it's great to have you. You've been doing fantastic reporting on all this. We just got today the CDC issuing some guidelines for school districts on when and how to open. And I was struck that there's a lot of steps to go through for schools to reopen.
Yeah, there is. I mean, they talk about protecting vulnerable staff. So maybe older teachers, older employees, protecting students who may have pre-existing health conditions, screening for symptoms. It's a little bit vague, but I think everyone I'm talking to is talking about temperature checks. Some school leaders even dream about being able to test for the virus, say with a saliva test right there on premises. These guidelines are much vaguer than that, but those are the types of sort of entryway practices. And that's before you even get into the building. Once you're in there, are kids going to be in smaller groups, eating lunch in classrooms, on shifts, so they only attend for some days of the week or parts of the day? It's not going to look like school usually looks like. I've heard educators talk about kids as young as 2 in preschools or daycares wearing masks. Certainly, these guidelines call for staff to wear masks. They don't talk about children wearing masks. I think that's going to need to be an issue of discussion. And whether just schools have the real estate, the physical space to distance children in this way is going to differ drastically depending on where in the country you are.
That's a great point. I love this image from China of a sort of creative way to get social distancing going among children with these little sort of handmade hats that were used and wings in this case, putting them out so that everyone sort of keeps their space. But what are we learning? There are other countries that have gone before us. Denmark has reopened schools. China has some people in schools. Sweden never shut its schools. What are we learning from other countries as they try to figure this out?
It's interesting. There's some great new reporting from JTA out today. That's a great news site that covers the Jewish world about what's going on in Israel. And in Israel, there was sort of a rushed 48-hour on-ramp to open schools. There were still crowds of kids and parents congregated at the entryways to the schools. And sure enough, they're saying about 40% of parents decided not to send their kids, which is not surprising. I'm a parent. I'm scared of my daughter going to school in the fall, and I'm also scared of keeping her home longer. Like you, I'm concerned about how this is impacting her, impacting our family. I'm so eager to get back to normal life, but it seems like so many in Israel said this was too rushed. There weren't the distancing practices in place, and they didn't have enough time to really learn about what the safety measures were going to be and get that reassurance from local and national governments. That could happen here.
Yeah, one of the things I've taken away from your reporting on this, and then the piece about Israel that you flagged earlier today, is that it's not a magic switch where you say, well, school's back because parents are going to vote with their feet to a certain extent, and that's going to have all kind of like privilege and class and socioeconomic dimensions to it as well. But unless there is some kind of plan in place for the educators, the administrators, the staff, and the parents and the teachers to think, okay, this is thought out, there's some risk minimization happening. You can't just be like, okay, everybody back in school.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, right now we know that the distance learning, the remote learning is not going as well as it should be. In some low-income districts, as many as half of kids are not participating in it regularly. There may be about 15% of students in some districts that are lost to schools right now. Teachers just simply cannot get in touch with them. So it makes a lot of sense to desperately want to come back. But parents of means, parents who can work from home, they may just say that they're not ready to take that risk. And then I think you have to ask the question, well, should we still go ahead anyways? Because these kids, some of them really need school right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the competing equities here are profound. I mean, if in terms of what a school system does and how important it is for it to be functioning. Parents' mental health as they try to educate their children every day. Just throwing that out there. But there's also, I mean, this story which I've avoided because it's like an emotional circuit breaker for me, which is this syndrome that we've seen in some kids, as many as 100 in New York. We've now seen it in LA. This Kawasaki syndrome that seems to strike children. I mean, one of the sort of blessings and graces here is that kids seem fairly immune, but it's a new virus, and all of a sudden you're dealing with a thing that may actually be getting kids sick. That also adds to me just some entire other layer of risk to this conversation.
Yeah, and I think this is what Dr. Fauci was saying in front of Congress that's important to highlight, which is that we still don't know. And there's certain humility that you must have in the face of this crisis and in the face of this virus, because what we thought we knew 2 months ago is not what we know now. So it's very few children who seem to be impacted by this inflammatory condition that's related to COVID, but those numbers may increase and likely will as the virus continues to spread to new parts of the country. So just continued, again, just humility. Can we acknowledge as a country what we don't know? And that we may need to move forward toward opening schools, taking on some risk, some uncertainty, and being ready to just continuously monitor how it's going and change plans midstream.
That's a great point. Those images we've been showing are people, schools around the world. Everyone's wrestling with this. I think you're right. We're going to have to try to open them in the fall and figure out the best way to do that and be open and humble and dynamic about it. Dana Goldstein, who is hands down one of the best education reporters in America, thank you so much for your time tonight.